Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now this is a cardboard box, and inside this box should be a PC that needs a little bit of a restoration. I purchased this apparent 6-core AMD machine on eBay for the grand sum of £70, and from what I saw in the pictures, well, it's in need of a tiny bit of an upgrade. So in today's one, we're going to clean it up, do a little bit of cable management where necessary, and give it a tiny bit of a GPU and RAM upgrade in order to get this thing gaming again. But of course, its gaming performance totally relies on what's already inside this system. So let's get it out of the box here and take an in-depth look at what we've got. So as you can see, this machine doesn't look to be in too bad of a condition. There are a few marks and scratches as described in the listing, but overall I think it looks okay. There's a couple of sticker marks here too, but the case has held up pretty well throughout the shipping process and since whenever this has been built. So let's take a look inside. And here we are. Well, it certainly looks like we've got the FX 6100 CPU as described in the listing, and I can see that this is indeed an AM3 Plus motherboard. Aside from that, the cables are a bit all over the place and there is a tiny bit of dust, so I guess we should probably get that cleaned up as well, just to make sure it doesn't interfere with thermals later down the line. First of all though, every time I purchase a brand new PC I like to give it a bit of an exterior clean, just to make sure we get rid of any fingerprints. It sounds like I'm cleaning up a crime scene, just in case there are any, greasy marks on it, bits of dust, things like that. It was then time to remove all of the internal components so that we could give the case a quick once over on the inside, removing any of that loose dust that I previously mentioned. Now the first step in doing this is just to disconnect basically every cable that goes to the motherboard, because we're just going to be removing the motherboard, CPU and RAM combo today. But I'll leave the hard drive and power supply in place, as these seem pretty clean and there isn't much dirt gathered up around here, though you can take everything out if you wish to. Once this was done, well, I gave the case a nice clean inside with this microfiber cloth here, and to be honest it really wasn't that dirty overall. I think the previous owner must have already cleaned it up, and that's nice to see because sometimes a PC will turn up and it will be absolutely caked in filth, and that isn't pleasant, to be honest, especially if it's 10 or 15 years worth of dust if you're opting for an older machine. Now to give this thing the best chance of gaming, I decided that we should probably replace the 4 gigs of RAM. As you can see, we've got two 2 gig sticks in here. I thought we should replace those with two 4 gigabyte sticks instead, and so I swapped these modules out for the ballistix sport memory, just standard speed, nothing special, ballistix sport, 4 gig DDR3. This will just give us generally better results in everyday usage as well as gaming. It's also a good idea to replace the thermal paste on the CPU whenever you purchase a second-hand PC, because it's always impossible to tell how long the original thermal paste has been under here. As you can see here, the thermal paste on this heatsink has obviously been here quite a while because it literally flaked off. All I had to do was pretty much look at it and it just started to fall off both the processor and heatsink here. You can then just replace this with a little pea-size amount of new thermal compound, and that should keep things nice and cool. Now I always find that AMD heatsinks are a little trickier than Intel stock ones to reinstall, but it shouldn't really be that difficult. All you've got to do is line these hooks up and flip the retention lever over once you've done that. When I first built an AMD PC, I remember thinking, this is the hardest thing I've ever done. I don't know why, but I just could not get the hooks in the right place. But now, of course, it's a pretty simple process to do. You'll know it's secure because you should be able to pick up the whole motherboard using just the heatsink, as I've done here. And once we've done that, we can put this combination back into our newly cleaned and dust-free case. Usually on micro ATX motherboards there should be about 6 screws, but if you've taken it out of a pre-built system in the first place, the motherboard that is, then you should know how many screws you removed, and therefore you'll know how many screws you've got to put back in. Next up, it's time to wire everything back up. Now although we've got a cheap power supply in here, I didn't think of replacing it because the graphics card I've got doesn't require a lot of power at all and will run solely off the motherboard power. I think this is some sort of CIT 400 watt power supply. It does have one 6-pin connector, but we won't even be needing that. And the good thing about these cheap power supplies, is risky as they can sometimes be for more powerful graphics card users, is that they don't often have a lot of cables. So cable management is actually made a little bit easier. Now that does not make up for the fact that they could blow up and take your whole system with them. But in this case, I've used CIT power supplies before and they seem okay, especially if you're using a weaker GPU. And if I was building this system from scratch, then I definitely wouldn't have picked this one out, put it that way. It's also very important to remember that you're probably going to want to install a fan at the rear of any PC you build. I haven't done so for this video because mine hasn't arrived. I thought this was a 120mm slot here, but it turns out that this requires a smaller fan, and I just don't have one of those right now, so I've purchased one, and as soon as it arrives I will be putting it at the back of this system to help with airflow. It's essential that you have at least one extra fan in your PC to help deal with the hot air. I'll also put the other side panel on because we're not going to be doing any cable management around this side because there simply isn't enough room here. I'm going to keep all of the cables inside the main part of the PC, just use a few cable ties to keep things a bit tidier. Now these cable ties are so handy, especially if you want to keep things neat inside a PC system. You literally just loop them around, pull them tight and cut off the excess bit here. You know, I still have no idea how you're supposed to remove these. I always just cut them off if I need to, but I think you can pull a little lever on them somewhere and they undo again, so they can be used more than once. I think it's probably important to hook up all the important cabling first before you do any cable management with these cable ties, because you never know when you might need to rearrange things a little bit, and if you've tied the cables up tight you might not be able to put them where you want to. As you can see here, I've connected the motherboard up, the 4-pin connector, as well as the SATA hard drive and DVD drive as well, and I'm trying to be as careful as I can about where I put the cables so that they're both neat and there isn't too much tension on them. I usually save the SATA cables until last because, well, I don't know why really. It's just the way I've always done it. I'm sure you all have your own unique way of putting together a PC and an order in which you do things, and I've always just put the SATA cables in last. The front panel connectors in this case were also pretty simple because they were colour coded, so the correct colour cable matched up to the colours on the motherboard, which was quite handy, and it saves you trying to see how they're labelled on the board itself. This is probably the most fiddly part of any computer build, is getting those front panel connectors hooked up. But once it's done, it's a pretty good feeling. So as you can see, our PC is a little bit cleaner now, a little bit tidier as far as cables are concerned, and it was time to put a graphics card inside this thing because we wouldn't be able to game without one. Now I chose an £80 GTX 1050 that I found second hand on the Overclockers website. In fact, I think this was an open box product. It requires no additional power, and so it will work just fine with this cheap 400 watt power supply. This is the sort of situation that a 1050 was designed for being put into PCs with sort of questionable power supply units, and you should be absolutely fine. Though as I say, if you're building a system from scratch, I would certainly recommend a better PSU, because you never know when you'll want to upgrade. And with that done, now it's time to check out some games. How does the FX 6100 handle games when paired with a GTX 1050 in what is a pretty cheap PC build? Now, because I seem to be having one of those weeks, all of the footage I captured from this PC went missing. I swapped the hard drive I recorded it to back into my PC and the folder was no longer there, which was an excellent start. So I'll just have to talk about the results to some non-representative background gameplay. Now in Cinebench R15, the CPU test, the FX 6100 sat between an old Core 2 Extreme at stock and overclock speeds. As you can see here, this gives you some idea of the level of performance of this older processor. And I have to say that actually using it doesn't feel all that snappy. Now these FX processors were never really regarded as very good, in all honesty. I had one a while ago and it seemed to be okay when paired with a 7950, but it was certainly the bottleneck in the system. When it came to games, we'll start off with Battlefield 5 here. You're probably going to have to expect closer to 30 frames per second than anything else. Now this isn't solely because of the CPU, but the GTX 1050 will also be the limiting factor in some instances. However, this is still a vast improvement over what we would have seen should we have no graphics card in here at all. And the intention here was just to get this old PC gaming again, and I think we've done that. At 1080p, you're going to be okay with low or medium settings throughout most of the titles that you try, and this isn't just for Battlefield 5, but it pretty much applied to all 4 games that I tested out today. Just Cause 4 as well, averaged just over 35 frames per second. Just don't expect to turn things right up. I think this is a more GPU intensive game anyway, so the higher load was definitely with the 1050 here. And in actual fact, both of these pair quite well together in the grand scheme of things. It's just that overall both of these are sort of entry level components. Shadow of the Tomb Raider, 41 frames per second on average here with the low, not the very low preset, but just the low preset here with anti-aliasing turned off. I just ran the in-game benchmark test. It's a good job we upgraded to that 8 gigs of RAM as well, because I'd consider that probably the bare minimum for modern AAA titles. 4 gigs might still work okay in some instances, but I found 8 gigs is still perfectly acceptable for 1080p gaming, and that's certainly the better way to go as we move into mid and late 2019. Finally, I ended with PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, and this ran the best with 53 frames per second on average. The 1% lows and 0.1% lows were also quite stuttery here, as they have been throughout. I think this is the processors doing. I saw quite a few stutters here and there, but as I said before, it's a big improvement over what we would have seen should we not have the 1050 or the 8 gigs of RAM in here. The idea here was just to get this thing gaming again on a small budget, and I think we've done an okay job of that. This would make a pretty decent basic PC, and there's something just exciting and very satisfying about taking an old computer that seems somewhat forgotten about and turning it into something that can actually handle certain situations again. So with that, I'm going to end. This has been the FX PC restoration. I hope you guys have enjoyed it. Let me know if you still use one of these FX 6100 processors in your PC, because I'd be interested in hearing how it performs for you, perhaps with a more powerful graphics card. I'll actually be taking a more in-depth look at this thing when paired with a more powerful GPU to see what sort of performance we can really squeeze out of it in 2019. But as for now, well, if you enjoyed it, leave a like, leave a dislike if you didn't. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see you all in the next one.